The cold prison floor was his last companion. Shackled, exhausted, and betrayed, Paul knew his fate was sealed. The dark corridors of the Roman prison muffled his final breaths as the guards prepared to take him to his execution. The great apostle, who had defied empires and kings, was now alone, condemned by the very system he once served. The man who had faced storms, stonings, and imprisonments was about to confront his final enemy, death. But before the sword struck its final blow, Paul spoke words that would echo for centuries, words that Rome tried to silence, words that history sought to hide. What did he say? And why did his death become one of the most shocking events of Christian persecution? What few know is that Paul was not just condemned, he was betrayed. Before his execution, alliances were broken, false friends emerged, and the most powerful empire on earth sealed his fate. But this story does not begin in his prison cell. It started years earlier with a relentless persecutor who would become Christianity's greatest defender. Get ready to uncover the dark truth behind Paul's execution, the conspiracies that led to his death, and his final words before the blade fell. This is the story of a man who did not fear the Roman Empire, but paid the ultimate price for his faith. Paul's story does not begin in a dark prison. Before being condemned by the Roman Empire, he was a man feared by Christians. His name was Saul, a zealous Pharisee who brutally persecuted Jesus' followers. He stormed into homes, dragged men and women to prison, and approved public executions. That was how he witnessed the death of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, without showing an ounce of compassion. But one single event changed everything. On the road to Damascus, Paul was struck down by a blinding light and heard a voice that would change his life forever. "Saul, why do you persecute me?" It was Jesus, the one he had been fighting against. Blinded and lost, Paul was taken to a man named Ananias, who restored his sight and revealed his new mission. Instead of persecuting Christians, he would now lead them. The same Jewish leaders who once supported him now saw him as a traitor. They tried to kill him multiple times. In Damascus, he barely escaped being lowered in a basket through the city wall. In Jerusalem, assassination plots forced him to flee. But the greatest threat was yet to come. On his missionary journeys, he founded churches across the Roman world. He endured imprisonments, shipwrecks, and persecutions, but nothing compared to what happened in Jerusalem. There, an enraged mob nearly killed him. He was accused of defiling the temple and teaching against the law of Moses. Dragged by Roman soldiers, he escaped death by a hair's breadth, but was placed in custody. And at that moment, his sentence was set in motion. Imprisoned, Paul was interrogated by governors and kings. In Caesarea, he stood before Governor Festus and King Agrippa, who listened to his defense but did not release him. Wanting to avoid being tried by the Jews, Paul made the request that would change everything: "I appeal to Caesar." As a Roman citizen, he had that right, but in doing so, he signed his own death warrant. Rome did not forgive those who challenged its authority. Paul was sent to Rome under guard, surviving a shipwreck along the way. When he finally arrived in the empire's capital, he was placed under house arrest, still able to preach. But then, something terrible happened. In 64 AD, a devastating fire destroyed much of Rome. The people blamed Nero, but the emperor needed a scapegoat, and he found one: the Christians. What followed was one of the cruelest persecutions in history. Christians were burned alive, thrown to wild beasts, and crucified. And as one of the most influential figures in the movement, Paul became an inevitable target. His house arrest ended, and he was thrown into one of the darkest places in Rome, the Mamertine prison. There he was isolated, betrayed, and abandoned by many of his former allies. The empire had already decided his fate. Paul was now a prisoner, condemned to death. Unlike Peter, who would be crucified, he received a more honorable sentence for a Roman citizen beheading. But there was a dark detail to this story. Paul knew his time was near, and his final words reflected someone who could already see beyond. He wrote his last letter to Timothy, saying, I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. In the darkness of his cell, his words echoed as a final testament. But what he didn't know was that his execution would bring forth a mystery that Rome could never erase. The soldiers finally came for him. Led outside the city walls, Paul did not scream, did not beg, and did not waver. He was ready to meet the one he had served all his life. But what happened at the moment of his death is something few know. In the darkness of the Mamertine prison, Paul felt the weight of betrayal and abandonment. His former allies had left him, his accusers had condemned him, and the empire had decreed his death. Only Luke remained by his side. The chains tightened around his aging wrists, but his faith remained unshaken. Even knowing the executioner's blade was sharpened, he wrote his final letter. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. These words echoed through the damp prison corridors. Paul did not see his death as a defeat, but as the completion of a mission. He knew his life was ending, but he did not fear what was coming. He was not just facing Nero or Rome, he was facing his own destiny. Morning came, and the guards opened the iron doors of his cell. Paul was taken out, shackled, and escorted by Roman soldiers. The crowd watched in silence as he walked through the streets of Rome. Among them were hidden Christians, but they dared not show support. Anyone identified as a follower of Christ could be next. The road to the execution site was long. He passed temples, markets, and monuments that symbolized Rome's power, an empire trying to destroy him without realizing that his legacy would outlast any Caesar. His head would fall that day, but his words would travel through centuries, transforming millions of lives, and Nero could do nothing to stop it. Arriving at the Trefontaine, where executions were carried out, Paul stood tall, unwavering. The soldiers prepared the execution block, and the executioner sharpened his sword. But before kneeling, one last mystery occurred. A Roman woman named Plautilla approached and offered her veil to cover Paul's eyes. He accepted, grateful, and made an unexpected promise. I will return it to you. Paul knelt, closed his eyes, and murmured one final prayer. He did not ask for deliverance nor for mercy. He prayed for his brothers in faith, for his persecutors, and even for Nero. Then, with a single stroke, the blade fell. His body collapsed, lifeless. The apostle was dead. But his story was far from over. Paul was betrayed, condemned, and executed, but his story could not be erased. What began as an act of persecution became one of the greatest spiritual revolutions in history. If Paul had given up, where would we be today? Step by step, the ritual, the dawn of execution. The day had barely begun when the heavy footsteps of soldiers echoed through the damp corridors of Mamertine prison. The keys turned in the lock and the iron door creaked open. The dim torchlight illuminated the figure of a weary man, his beard graying, his eyes deep. Paul already knew this was his final day. With his wrists shackled and a chain dragging along the ground, Paul stepped out of his cell without resistance. The soldiers pushed him forward, but he did not hesitate. The cold Roman morning cut against his skin, but he remained firm. Outside, the city was already awakening, yet few knew the vanishing veil. Days after the execution, Plautilla, the woman who had given Paul her veil, reported something even stranger. She claimed to have seen Paul in a vision, returning the veil she had lent him. This story spread among the Christians, deepening the mystery surrounding the apostle. He had departed, yet traces of his presence still seemed to echo on earth. The body and the secret tomb. The few Christians who witnessed the execution risked their lives to retrieve Paul's body. They took it in secret and buried him in an undisclosed location. For years, his grave was kept hidden from the empire's eyes, but even in death, his influence only grew. His writing spread, his words gained strength, and his story became immortal. And what of Nero, the man who ordered Paul's death? Less than a year later, his empire began to crumble. Surrounded by enemies, hated by his own people, he ended his life with a knife to his throat. Rome endured, but his name was forever marked by tyranny. Who truly won this battle? Paul's victory. Rome killed Paul, but it could not erase his message. His teachings became the foundation of Christianity, his letters shaped the faith of millions, and his courage became an eternal example. Today, 2,000 years later, his name is still remembered, while the emperors who tried to destroy him have been forgotten. In the end, the true crown did not belong to Caesar. It belonged to the one who fought the good fight, finished the race, and kept the faith. Paul's story teaches us that true greatness is not found in earthly power, but in the impact we leave on the world. Rome tried to silence him, but his words still echo today. And now, I want to hear from you. Does Paul's sacrifice still influence faith today? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, share this video so more people can hear it. Leave a like to help the algorithm spread this message further. And if you want more content like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos uncovering hidden truths from history. Was what happened to Paul a tragedy or a victory? He lost his life, but he gained eternity. And his story leaves us with one final question. If it were you in his place, would you keep your faith until the end? Think about it.